Case 1. Sarah Boon. She had her phone in her hand the entire time. Her boyfriend was folded inside a suitcase, zipped shut, begging her to let him out, telling her over and over that he could not breathe. And instead of reaching for the zipper, she reached for the record button. 2 separate videos, filmed about 11 minutes apart. In one of them you can hear her laughing while he pleads. By sunrise he was gone, and those videos were still sitting on her phone. Sarah Boon lived in Winter Park, Florida. On the night of February 23, 2020, she told police that she and her boyfriend, Jorge Torres Jr., had been drinking and playing a game of hide-and-seek in their apartment. Torres was 42 years old. Somehow, during that game, he ended up inside a large blue suitcase, and Boon pulled the zipper closed over him. What happened next, she chose to document, on her own phone, in 2 short clips that would later be played in a courtroom. In the footage, the suitcase rocks on the floor. You can hear Torres pushing against the fabric from the inside, calling her name, telling her he genuinely cannot breathe. Boon does not open it. She talks over him. She tells him that this is what he gets, that this is how she feels when he cheats on her. A second clip, recorded minutes later, shows the suitcase flipped to a different position. Then the recordings stop, and there is only silence. Those 2 clips are 11 minutes apart, which means she had time between them to think, to reach over and let him out, and she did neither. Her account was that she went upstairs, fell asleep, and only realised something was wrong the next morning when she came back down and found him unresponsive inside the bag. She called for help on February 24th. Firefighters confirmed what she already knew. Torres was dead, and the medical examiner ruled that he had suffocated inside the suitcase, unable to draw a proper breath in the position he was trapped in. There were scratches on his back and neck, and bruising on his forehead, the small, desperate signs of a man trying to claw his way out. She was arrested the following day. Here is what makes this case so difficult to look away from. Boon did not need anyone else to build a case against her. The story she told, the accident, the game that got out of hand, collapsed the moment investigators recovered those clips from her phone and pressed play. Her own voice, mocking a dying man, was the whole case laid out in her own hand. Getting her in front of a jury took years, and a lot of that delay was her own doing. Boon burned through one attorney after another, 9 lawyers in total, most of them appointed by the court, each one withdrawing or being pushed aside. At one point, the judge simply refused to let her swap again, writing that another new lawyer would only stall the case even longer. When it finally reached trial in the autumn of 2024, the heart of the evidence was still those 2 videos. Her defense tried to reframe what the footage showed. Her lawyers argued that Boon was herself a survivor of domestic abuse, that Torres had hurt her for years, and that what looked like cruelty on the recording was the reaction of a woman pushed past her breaking point. Prosecutors countered that none of that gave her the right to record a man suffocating and do nothing. Whatever had passed between the 2 of them before that night, the video showed someone helpless, trapped and pleading, and a woman who had the power to save him and simply chose not to. The panel was made up of 5 women and 1 man, and they did not deliberate for long. After roughly 90 minutes on October 25, 2024, they found Sarah Boon guilty of second-degree murder, a charge that carried a minimum of more than 22 years. On December 2, 2024, Judge Michael Kranick went all the way and sentenced her to life in prison. Torres left behind his mother Blanca, his sister Victoria, and a young daughter Anna. All of them stood in that courtroom and spoke about the man in the suitcase as a person rather than a headline. His sister described a particular torment most families never face. She knew exactly what her brother's final minutes sounded like because the woman who killed him had recorded them and kept them. Boon has kept fighting the conviction from behind bars, filing to challenge it and insisting she did not get a fair trial. So far, the verdict has held. That single detail sets this entire list in motion. Sarah Boon did not just take a life. She filmed it, narrated it, and saved it to her camera roll. The same phone she used to capture her boyfriend's last breaths became the one piece of evidence that sent her away for the rest of her own. Boon aimed the lens at her victim herself, deliberately, with the recording running. The next woman never touched a camera at all. She hired a stranger to carry one, for a reason that had nothing to do with murder, and that stranger ended up filming a killing in a hotel parking lot in the middle of the evening. Case 2. Clara Harris. She wanted proof that her husband was cheating, so she paid a private investigator to follow him and told the firm to bring a video camera and get it all on tape. That camera was rolling when Clara Harris found her husband at a hotel with another woman, and it was still rolling a few minutes later when she climbed into her silver Mercedes and used it to end his life in front of the very building where the two of them had gotten married. Clara Harris was a dentist in the Houston area, a Colombian immigrant who had once been crowned a local beauty queen and by all appearances a pillar of her community. She was married to a fellow dental professional named David Harris. David was 44 years old and ran a chain of orthodontic offices with her, and together they had twin boys, born in 1998. In the summer of 2002, Clara became convinced David was having an affair with a former receptionist. Rather than confront him blindly, on July 23rd, she hired a firm called Blue Moon Investigations and asked them to catch him in the act. The next evening, July 24, 2002, the investigator tracked David to the Nassau Bay Hilton, a hotel that carried a cruel kind of history for the couple. It was the same place where Clara and David had celebrated their wedding a decade earlier. Clara drove out there herself, bringing along her 16-year-old stepdaughter, Lindsay. Inside, she found David with the other woman, and a furious confrontation erupted in the lobby before hotel staff stepped in and the couple spilled back out toward the parking lot. What happened next became one of the most infamous pieces of footage in American true crime. The private investigator Clara had hired, sitting nearby with a camera meant to document an affair, instead recorded David walking through the lot and Clara's Mercedes surging toward him. The car struck him, sent him to the pavement, and then circled back. On the tape you can see the vehicle making tight loops in the lot. David Harris died that night from massive blunt force trauma, pronounced dead just before 10 o'clock in the evening. His own daughter had watched it happen. The killing itself was never really in question because it had been filmed. What the two sides fought over was how many times the car passed over him. Several eyewitnesses at the hotel, including managers and a tennis player on a nearby court, testified that Clara ran over her husband multiple times, 3 or even 4 passes, including one in reverse. Her defense pushed back hard. Their collision expert studied the skid marks and the turning radius of the Mercedes and argued that she had struck David only once, then circled without hitting him again. The jury was left to weigh grainy video against human memory, and neither told a perfectly clean story. Her trial began in Harris County in January of 2003. Clara's stepdaughter Lindsay, who had been in the car, testified about that night. Prosecutors leaned on the investigators' tape and the crowd of witnesses. Her lawyers leaned on the idea that this was a wife destroyed by betrayal, acting in a single moment of blind rage rather than cold calculation. On February 14, 2003, Valentine's Day of all days, the jury reached a verdict. They convicted Clara Harris of murder, but they also found that she had acted under what Texas law calls sudden passion, a finding that limited how long she could be sentenced. She received 20 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, the maximum allowed under that finding. The head of the investigation firm, Bobby Batcher, later said that without the video her agency captured, David Harris might never have gotten any justice at all. Clara Harris did not spend the rest of her life behind bars. She was denied parole more than once, in 2013 and again in 2016, before finally being granted release. She walked out on May 11, 2018, after serving about 15 years, and completed her parole a few years later. The twin boys she shared with David were raised by close family friends, Pat and Anna Jones, growing up in the long shadow of a killing the whole country had watched on tape. The tape made the case a sensation. It played on news broadcasts and true crime programs for years afterward, held up as the definitive image of a marriage that ended in the parking lot where it began. For a long time, Clara Harris was less a person than a symbol, the wronged wife who took her revenge in the most public way imaginable, and all of it preserved on a video she had paid for herself. What lingers about this case is the camera. Clara Harris went looking for evidence of a betrayal, and she got it. She just never imagined that the same lens she pointed at her husband's affair would end up capturing his death, and then be turned around and aimed straight at her. In Clara's case, at least the camera was there on purpose, held by a person who was paid to be watching. The next woman on this list was filmed by a camera that no one was even holding. It sat on a shelf, took a handful of photos entirely by accident, and quietly recorded a murder as it was happening. If these cases are pulling you in, do the free thing and hit subscribe. It is the one button that keeps stories like this one coming. Case 3. Jodi Arias. A camera does not lie, even when the person holding it does. Jodi Arias told police 3 different stories about the day her former boyfriend died. First, she was never there. Then 2 masked intruders did it. Then it was self-defense, and she claimed he had attacked her. What she did not count on was a small digital camera that had been dropped during the killing, snapping pictures on its own, and then being run through a wash cycle in a failed attempt to erase what it had seen. Jodi Arias was 27 years old, an aspiring photographer who had drifted through waitressing jobs when she met Travis Alexander at a work convention in Las Vegas in 2006. Travis was a 30-year-old salesman and motivational speaker, well-liked and deeply involved in his church. The two of them dated, broke up, and stayed tangled together in an on and off relationship that grew more obsessive on her side as it went. She followed him into his faith, moved closer to be near him, and when he finally tried to pull away for good, she would not let go. By the end, friends of Travis had grown uneasy about how fixated she had become on him. On June 4, 2008, Travis was killed inside his home in Mesa, Arizona. 5 days later, worried friends went to check on him after he stopped answering, and they found his body in the shower. He had been stabbed close to 30 times and had also been fatally shot. It was a brutal, overwhelming attack, the kind that told investigators this was personal rather than random. When detectives first spoke to Arias, she swore she had never set foot in Travis's home that day. As the evidence stacked up, her story changed. She now claimed that 2 masked strangers had burst in, killed Travis, and left her too terrified to say anything. When that version fell apart, she settled on self-defense, insisting Travis had turned violent and she had fought for her life. 3 stories, told to the same investigators, each one collapsing into the next. Here is where the camera comes in. On the day he died, Travis and Jodi had been taking photographs together in his home. That camera was later recovered from his washing machine, where someone had tried to destroy it, but the memory card survived, and forensic examiners pulled the deleted images back off it. What those pictures showed, laid out by their timestamps, was a timeline no alibi could beat. The earlier photos showed Travis alive, posing in the shower late that afternoon. Then, within the same short window, came images that were clearly never meant to be taken. One appears to be an accidental shot of the ceiling, snapped as the camera was dropped. Another, moments later, shows Travis bleeding on the bathroom floor. Prosecutors argued that a foot visible in one frame belonged to Jodi, and that the sequence captured the killing as it unfolded. These were still pictures, not a video, but stitched together they placed her in that bathroom at the exact moment Travis went from alive to dying. Everything else about the scene closed the trap. A bloody palm print on the wall contained a mix of Travis's blood and Jodi's DNA. Her shifting stories only made things worse. By the time the case reached a courtroom, the accidental photographs had become the spine of the prosecution. A forensic analyst from the city of Mesa walked the jury through them frame by frame, and the lead detective, Esteban Flores, laid out how everything fit together. Her trial, held in Maricopa County, became a national spectacle, broadcast live and dissected on every cable channel. Arias herself testified for days, spinning out her self-defense story, while the accidental photos sat there contradicting her. In May of 2013, the jury convicted Jodi Arias of first-degree murder. What followed was years of legal limbo over her punishment. 2 separate juries were asked to decide whether she should be executed, and both times they could not reach a unanimous decision on the death penalty. By the time it was over, her face was on magazine covers, and her testimony had been picked apart on live television for the better part of a year. With the death penalty off the table, the sentencing fell to the judge. On April 13, 2015, Judge Sherry Stevens sentenced Jodi Arias to natural life in prison, meaning no possibility of release, ever. Travis Alexander's sisters sat through all of it. Afterward, they spoke about the harassment they endured from Arias supporters, including autopsy photographs of their brother sent to them online. A fresh cruelty layered on top of the loss. The strange, chilling truth of this case is that no one intended to film anything violent. A camera used for ordinary snapshots caught something monstrous purely by accident and then refused to let it be washed away. That handful of frames did what none of Jodi Arias' lies could undo. 2 of these killings were captured by cameras pointed at the wrong thing at the right time, a phone and a dropped snapshot. The next one was caught by the kind of camera that watches all of us, all the time. A quiet road in England, an ordinary night, and a set of headlights doing something no witness could quite believe. Case 4. Alice Wood. The camera on that quiet Cheshire road caught the whole thing in cold, silent detail. A young woman gets out of a car after an argument. He walks away from her, and then the car turns, aims itself at him, and does not stop. This was not a moment of panic behind the wheel. It was a choice she made, over and over, while a street camera recorded every second. Alice Wood was 22 years old, a student at the University of Manchester, who had earned a research scholarship and seemed to have a bright, ordinary future stretching out in front of her. She was in a relationship with a 24-year-old man named Ryan Watson. Ryan worked as a support worker for a brain injury charity, the kind of job people take because they genuinely want to help others. On May 6, 2022, the couple went to a birthday party in Hanley in Stoke-on-Trent for one of the people Ryan supported through that charity. At the party, Wood grew convinced that Ryan was paying too much attention to another woman there, and jealousy simmered through the night. By the time they left, they were arguing over who should drive, and the tension followed them all the way back toward their home in the village of Road Heath. Whatever was said in that car, it did not cool down. It boiled over the moment they arrived. What happened next was captured across more than one camera. CCTV from the party venue and from a restaurant near their house tracked the couple driving home, with Wood at the wheel and well over the drink-drive limit. Then, close to their front door, the footage shows Ryan getting out of the vehicle. It shows him crossing the road, and it shows Wood reverse her car straight into him, then drive forward and strike him again, coming at him several times before dragging him beneath the vehicle for around 158 metres up the road. Prosecutors would later describe that distance in the plainest possible terms: a young man pinned under a car and pulled along the tarmac for the length of well over a football pitch. Investigators pieced the night together from several cameras, one angle handing off to the next, until they had an almost unbroken record of the drive and the killing. When paramedics reached the scene, Ryan was already gone. The cause of death was crush asphyxiation, the weight of the car pressing the life out of him. In the hours and days that followed, her story kept changing. At the scene, she asked a nearby resident to call an ambulance, saying she thought she had run over her boyfriend. To officers, she muttered that it was fine, that she deserved whatever was coming. She even told her own doctor that Ryan had died the previous week after jumping in front of her car. None of it matched the footage, and none of it could. When detectives questioned her, Wood mostly stayed silent, answering with no comment. But the admissions kept slipping out around the edges anyway, to the resident on the street, to the officers who arrested her, to her own doctor. The court would later hear that she had accepted her guilt more than once before she ever set foot inside a courtroom. The footage from that road was eventually released to the public, and people who watched it struggled to accept that anyone could do such a thing on purpose. At Chester Crown Court, her trial ran for around 3 weeks. Prosecutors did not have to rely on memory or interpretation, because the jury could simply watch what she had done. Wood had denied both murder and the lesser charge of manslaughter, but on January 2, 2024, the jury unanimously found her guilty of murder. The prosecution described the motive plainly. Alice Wood's jealousy had been reason enough for her to kill a young man with his whole life in front of him. On February 2, 2024, the judge, Michael Leeming, sentenced her to life in prison with a minimum term of 18 years. He told her directly that prison might be hard for her, but that she had no one to blame for her situation except herself. Ryan Watson's family said afterward that they had finally gotten justice for the son and brother they lost, though nothing about a verdict could bring him home. They spoke of a gentle young man who had spent his working life caring for people with brain injuries and who died on the road just outside the home he shared with the woman who killed him. What makes this case so damning is that there was no gap for doubt to slip through. Alice Wood did not have to be placed at the scene by fibres or phone records or a nervous witness. A camera bolted to a building had already watched her turn a car into a weapon and use it, and no clever story could rewrite footage that had been recording the entire time. So far, the cameras in these cases belonged to other people or to the street. The next woman aimed the camera at herself. In the weeks before she killed her husband, she filmed her own cruelty again and again, and even recorded herself promising exactly what she was going to do to him. Take 1 second and subscribe before the next case. It costs you nothing, and it tells us to keep digging into cases the world moved on from. Case 5. Morin Rickards. Most killers try to hide what they are capable of. Morin Rickards recorded it. In the weeks before her husband died, she pulled out her phone and filmed herself beating him, mocking him, and telling him, out loud, that she was going to kill him. He can be heard begging her to stop. She kept the videos, and when he finally turned up dead, those recordings became a confession she had made long before anyone found the body. Morin Rickards was in her early 50s and lived in Canterbury, in the county of Kent, in England. She had met Jeremy Rickards back in 1997 in Marley, when she was in her 20s and studying law. The two of them married and stayed together for around 27 years. Jeremy was 65, a geologist who had spent his career on mining projects around the world, and the people who knew him described him as gentle, mild-mannered and softly spoken. He had helped raise Maureen's daughter as his own. Beneath the surface of that long marriage, though, ran a current of control and violence, and Morin was the one holding the power. To the outside world, there was little sign of any of this. Jeremy did not report her, did not leave, and did not tell the people around him how bad things had become at home. The abuse stayed hidden behind that long, settled marriage, and it might have stayed hidden for good if Morin had not chosen to point a camera at it herself. In the period before his death, she assaulted him repeatedly and left him with injuries that were still healing when he died. What sets this case apart is that she documented her own abuse. On June 7, 2024, she recorded a clip that ran for around 15 minutes, filming herself hitting and taunting Jeremy while he pleaded with her to stop hurting him. In a separate recording, she can be heard telling him that she will kill him that very night, that she just needs a few minutes to do it. These were not messages she sent in anger and regretted. She saved them. Around June 9, 2024, she made good on that promise. Jeremy Rickards was stabbed to death, struck 5 times in a ferocious attack. What she did afterward was calculated and cold. She hid his body inside their home, then moved it out to the garden, concealing it inside a bag beneath a pile of grass cuttings, and even paid a man to help cover the spot without telling him what was underneath. The gentle geologist who had worked on projects across the world died in the home he shared with her, in the quiet county where the two of them had built a life together. Then she tried to erase Jeremy from the world quietly. She sent messages from his phone pretending he had travelled abroad for work, telling family he was away in Saudi Arabia. For a little while, it held, but Jeremy's daughter grew suspicious of the strange messages, and on July 5, 2024, she reported him missing. Kent police opened an inquiry, and it led them straight to Morin. Officers found Jeremy's body on July 11th. By then, Morin was already sitting in custody over fraud, because she had been using his bank cards the whole time she claimed he was alive and travelling. The case that prosecutors built was overwhelming, and a great deal of it came from Maureen's own hand. Detectives sifted through more than 35,000 items of evidence, but at the centre of it all sat her videos, the ones where she is seen threatening Jeremy, using violence against him, and stating plainly that she meant to kill him. She had, in effect, filmed the build-up to her own crime and stored it on her phone. For the officers involved, it was their first major murder investigation, and the sheer volume of material they worked through only underlined how much the case finally turned on the woman's own recordings. Her trial ran for 18 days at Canterbury Crown Court. On March 13, 2025, the jury unanimously found Morin Rickards guilty of murder. The judge, Mr. Justice Kerr, made a point of addressing those recordings directly, telling her that her own videos clearly showed her threatening Jeremy, abusing him, using violence on him, and expressing her intention to kill him. On April 9, 2025, she was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 22 years. She refused even to appear on the video link for her own sentencing. Jeremy's family were left to mourn a gentleman who had suffered in silence, while the recordings of his final weeks spoke louder than any words ever could. It is one thing for a killer to be caught on someone else's camera. It is another thing entirely to hand investigators the footage yourself, to film your own threats and your own cruelty and keep it, as if daring the world to watch. Morin Rickards did exactly that, and every second of it worked against her. The cameras so far have been phones and street corners and accidents. The next one was a security camera bolted to a wall outside a bar, watching an ordinary fight break out when a 70-year-old woman reached for something hidden inside her walking cane. Case 6. Renee DiPetro. A bar fight is the kind of thing that usually ends with a few bruises and a story to tell the next morning. This one ended with a 70-year-old woman drawing a hidden blade from her walking cane and driving it into a man's chest, then standing over him as he bled and taking one more swing. And every second of it, the strike, the stab, the taunt, sat on a security camera that a jury would later watch in complete silence. Renee DiPetro was 70 years old, from Philadelphia, an age most people picture with grandchildren and quiet retirement rather than a homicide charge. The night it all happened, June 10, 2023, began with her adult son Jason getting into trouble at a bar in Ardmore, a suburb in Lower Merion Township just west of the city. Jason had thrown a punch at a friend of a man named Michael Sides and had been thrown out of the bar for it. Instead of heading home to sleep it off, he called his parents, and rather than tell him to walk away, they came to him. The DiPetro family arrived on that street corner armed. They brought a baseball bat, and Renee brought her cane, the kind that looks like an ordinary walking stick, but conceals a long, thin blade inside the shaft. Michael Sides, who was 31 years old and tended bar for a living, came over as Jason was climbing back into the family car, and the confrontation flared up all over again. What happened in the next few seconds would send a grandmother to prison for what may be the rest of her life. DiPetro swung the cane at Sides. The outer sheath slipped away, exposing the blade, and she drove it home. It was a single wound, but it was enough. Michael Sides collapsed on the pavement and was rushed to a nearby hospital, where he was pronounced dead a short time later, over a fight that had never even been his to begin with. Here is the part that turned a chaotic brawl into a murder conviction. A surveillance camera had recorded the entire encounter from start to finish. On the footage, the jury could see DiPetro stab Sides and then stand over him as he lay bleeding on the ground and take another swing in his direction. They could see the people around him do nothing, make no move to help, place no call for aid while his life ran out on the concrete. And they could see DiPetro walk to the car and bend its license plate upward, folding the metal to hide the numbers, as though she already knew someone would soon be hunting for that vehicle. That camera did what no single witness ever could. It answered every question about who did what to whom, calmly and without bias. Even so, the case did not rest on the video alone. Witnesses, including a friend of Sides named Dan Rogers, described the attack to police. And that August, roughly 2 months after the killing, DiPetro turned herself in and handed over the very knife she had used. Her trial took place in Montgomery County, in front of Judge Wendy Rothstein. It lasted only 2 days, and after around 6 hours of deliberation, on February 1st, 2024, the jury found Renee DiPetro guilty of third-degree murder and of possessing an instrument of crime. Her defense had leaned on the picture of an elderly mother protecting her son from a larger, younger man. Prosecutors painted something far colder, a woman who did not simply defend her child, but escalated a shoving match into a killing, and then stood over the dying man and mocked him. One of the prosecutors told the court that while Sides lay gasping and bleeding out, DiPetro loomed over him, posturing, and took another swing. On April 15, 2024, she learned her sentence, and it was harsher than even the state had asked for. Prosecutors had recommended a term of 7 to 20 years. Judge Rothstein went all the way to the maximum instead, 20 to 40 years, and she pointed squarely at DiPetro's total absence of remorse. The judge told her, in plain language, that she was the one who had escalated the situation, that she had taken Michael Sides' life and then stood over him and taunted him as he died. At 70 years old, a term like that is, in all likelihood, a life sentence in everything but name. Michael Sides was remembered by the people who loved him as a gentleman who adored animals, a neighbourhood bartender who left behind grieving parents and a grandmother of his own. For them, the sentence offered a measure of justice, though nothing could rewind the handful of seconds a camera had captured on a dark suburban street. There is something almost impossible to believe about a 70-year-old woman carrying a sword inside her cane and using it in a parking lot fight. But a lens does not care how unlikely a killer looks, or how old, or how ordinary. It simply records. The next woman on this list clearly understood that a camera could place her near a scene. What she may not have counted on was one that would catch her walking straight up to her sleeping victim in the dead of night, even if the very worst of what she did happened just outside the frame. If you have made it this far, go ahead and tap subscribe. It is free, it takes a moment, and it is what keeps this channel alive. Case 7. Inari Molina. A man was asleep in his truck in a parking lot when a figure in a wig and a jogging suit crossed the tarmac in the dead of night and quietly opened his door. A security camera caught her walking straight toward him. What it could not show was what she did once that door swung open, 36 times over, inside a cab that became a sealed box in the dark. Inari Molina was 24 years old at the time, from Glen Burnie, Maryland, with a history of prowling parking lots and breaking into cars to take whatever she could find inside them. Her victim was a 56-year-old man named Brian Gifford, who did not have a permanent home and often slept in his truck, parking near the sites where he was due to work the following day. He was not chosen for any reason anyone could ever explain to his family. He was simply a working man, asleep in a vehicle when Molina came prowling. Gifford's truck had pulled into a lot on Aquahart Road on the evening of July 16, 2019, and that was the last day his co-workers saw him alive. In the early hours of the next morning, Molina crossed that lot toward him. Then days went by with no word from Gifford at all. He was reported missing on the 23rd of July, and on the 27th, his body was finally discovered inside the truck after someone nearby noticed a foul odour coming from the vehicle. He had been stabbed 36 times, and the medical examiner ruled his death a homicide. This is where the camera enters the story, and it matters to be exact about what it did and did not capture. Surveillance footage from the lot showed a person matching Molina, tall and thin, wearing that distinctive wig and striped jogging suit, walking across the parking lot to Gifford's truck at around 4:30 in the morning and opening his door. The camera placed her there, at that truck, at that hour, beyond any real argument. What it did not show was the attack itself, which happened at the vehicle, out of the camera's clear line of sight. The footage captured the approach and the opening of the door. The 36 wounds that followed were reconstructed from the evidence left behind inside. And that evidence was damning. Witnesses in the surrounding area told police about an unsettling encounter with a tall, thin person in a wig and a jogging suit. Someone who had approached them in the night, asking for money and cigarettes, and the description lined up with the figure caught on camera. A bloodstain found inside Gifford's truck was tested and came back matching Molina's DNA. Detectives also noticed something telling on Molina herself, a deep cut on one of her fingers that had healed badly, the kind of wound a person can inflict on their own hand during a frenzied attack. The investigation was led by detectives with the Anne Arundel County Police, and the case was prosecuted by the county state's attorney, Ann Colt Lites. Confronted with the surveillance placing her at the truck, the DNA found inside it, and the witnesses who had spoken to her that night, Molina did not gamble on a jury. On May 19, 2022, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. Later that year, she was sentenced to life in prison with all but 60 years suspended, which in practice meant 60 years of hard time behind bars. The state's attorney was blunt about what had actually happened in that parking lot. She described how Gifford had been sitting in his own truck when Molina opened the door, apparently to search for anything worth stealing, and how, upon finding a living person inside rather than an empty cab, Molina did not back away or abandon the theft. Instead, she attacked him dozens of times. It was, the prosecutor stressed, an entirely unprovoked killing between two people who were complete strangers. For the people who knew Brian Gifford, the hardest part was how ordinary his last evening had been. He had finished a day of work and gone to sleep where he always slept, in the one small space that was truly his. He was not out looking for trouble, not tangled up in anything dangerous, just a man without a front door of his own, resting in the cab of his truck. That a stranger crossed a dark parking lot and turned that private refuge into the place he died is the kind of detail that stays with a case long after the sentence is read. What makes this case sit so uneasily is that gap in the footage. The camera followed Molina right up to the second she reached for that door handle, and then the darkness inside the cab swallowed everything that came next. A machine watched a killer walk to her sleeping victim and open his door, and then had to look away for the part that would define the rest of both their lives. It was enough to place her there beyond dispute, and enough, in the end, to lock her away for decade upon decade. The next case leaves no gap at all. There is no dark cab, no closed door, no missing angle to argue over. Instead, there is a crowd, a gun, and one of the most heavily watched streets in America, where a single shot, fired into a fight, found a father who was only passing through. Case 8. Mia Lindsay. On one of the most watched streets in America, a fight spilled out into a late-night crowd, and a young woman raised a gun and fired into it. Hundreds of feet away, a father of two who had come to the city for a family weekend was walking down Bourbon Street when the bullet found him. A network of cameras spread across the city caught the shot, and it was that footage that ended up putting her away. Mia Lindsay was 22 years old, from Columbia, Mississippi. The man who died had nothing whatsoever to do with her, her friends, or the argument that set the whole thing off. His name was Christopher Oates Jr. He was 39 years old. He worked as a warehouse manager for a company back in Orlando, Florida, and he was a father of two. He had come to New Orleans for a weekend with his family, just another visitor on a famous street. In exactly the wrong place, at exactly the wrong second. It happened shortly after 4 in the morning, on June 22nd, 2024, in the heart of the French Quarter, along the 600 block of Bourbon Street. A group that Lindsay was part of had gotten into a fight, and as the trouble moved through the packed crowd, Lindsay pulled out a gun and fired. The bullet travelled hundreds of feet down the street before it struck Christopher Oates. He was rushed to the hospital, but he could not be saved. Within days, Lindsay and another young woman, Mariah Campbell, were arrested back in Mississippi. The reason investigators could say with such confidence who had fired the fatal shot comes down to the cameras. New Orleans is watched over by a private, non-profit network of crime cameras that blanket the busiest corners of the city, feeding footage that police can pull when something goes wrong. That network captured the movements of Lindsay's group, and the moment the shot was fired. Prosecutors later played that footage for the jury. It followed the chaos in the crowd. It identified Lindsay as the person who fired the gun, and it showed her walking away toward a car afterward. Detectives traced that vehicle all the way to Mississippi, where the case against her slowly came together. For a shooting in the middle of a moving, panicked crowd, that footage was everything. Without it, this might have been just another French Quarter tragedy, with too many witnesses and no clear answer. A bullet that came out of the chaos and seemed to belong to no one at all. Instead, a camera mounted high on a pole had watched the whole thing unfold, steady and unblinking, and it handed prosecutors a shooter with a face. The young woman arrested alongside her, Mariah Campbell, was tied to the events of that night as the case moved forward, but it was Lindsay whom the footage placed behind the trigger. Lindsay was tried at the Orleans Parish Criminal District Court in front of Judge Nandy Campbell. The trial lasted 3 days. In the spring of 2026, the jury came back with a verdict, though not the one prosecutors had charged. Rather than second-degree murder, they convicted her of the lesser count of manslaughter, and they cleared her of a separate obstruction charge. In the language of the law, it was a finding that Lindsay had not set out that night meaning to kill the particular man she killed. She had fired a gun into a crowd, and a stranger a football field away had paid for it with his life. For that, Mia Lindsay was sentenced to 28 years in prison. At her sentencing, the people who loved Christopher Oates rose to speak, among them his father and one of his young sons, who had to stand in a courtroom and describe a life now missing a dad. His sister put the loss into arithmetic that no legal ruling could ever match. She said the family had come to New Orleans as a party of 8 and had gone home as a party of 7, and that her brother had made the trip back a week later in a box. Those few plain words carried the whole weight of it. A man who managed a warehouse, who did all the quiet, invisible work of being somebody's father, had flown into a city for a happy weekend and left it in a coffin. He never met Mia Lindsay. He was never part of her night, or her fight, or her argument. He simply walked down the wrong block at the wrong moment, into the path of a bullet that was never meant for him. This case sits right at the blurred edge of what a camera can truly prove. The shot itself was recorded, the shooter was identified, and the footage was solid enough to convince a jury. But the killing was never aimed at the person it actually claimed. Christopher Oates was not Lindsay's enemy, not her target, not a part of her fight in any way. He was a man on a sidewalk, filmed by the very same cameras that filmed the woman who ended his life. The two of them caught in the same handful of frames on a street that never stops watching. The next case flips the camera around entirely. This time the lens did not capture the shooter, or the weapon, or the moment of the attack. It captured only the aftermath, the part that came once the violence was already done, when a dying man went from door to door in the dark, begging anyone at all to let him in. One small thing before we go on. Subscribing is free and takes a second, and it means the next investigation lands on your feed instead of slipping away. Case 9. Melissa McNutt. No camera caught the stabbing itself. None recorded the robbery, or the moment the trigger was pulled. What one did capture was the aftermath. A wounded man stumbling from door to door in the dark, banging and pleading for someone, anyone, to open up and help him before he bled out on a stranger's porch. That footage of his final minutes is what eventually led police back to the woman who had left him there to die. Melissa McNutt was 25 years old, from the Tampa area of Florida. A prosecutor would later say that she did not look like someone capable of killing anyone, and that this was exactly what made her so dangerous. Her victim was a 34-year-old man named Justin Heilig, who had travelled down from Salisbury, North Carolina. The two of them were strangers to each other. On the night everything happened, Heilig was out enjoying the nightlife in the Ybor City district of Tampa, and at some point he was seen climbing into the passenger seat of McNutt's black sedan. Earlier that same evening, he had posted a cheerful late-night selfie online, an ordinary man having what looked like an ordinary night out. Whatever passed between the two of them inside that car, it ended with McNutt robbing Heilig, stabbing him, and shooting him. She then drove away and left him in the Hyde Park neighbourhood to fend for himself. In the small hours of September 30th, 2018, he was found collapsed on the front porch of a home, bleeding heavily from his wounds. Neighbours called for help and he was rushed to a hospital, but it was already too late to save his life. The footage that made this case so haunting came from home surveillance cameras mounted on the houses along that quiet residential street. They recorded Heilig, already fatally wounded, moving from door to door, hammering on them and begging for help in what turned out to be the last minutes of his life. A separate camera captured McNutt's car pulling away from the area after neighbours reported hearing gunshots. It is worth being clear about what these cameras did and did not show. They did not record the attack, which happened out of sight in and around her vehicle. What they preserved instead was the terrible result of it, a man's final frantic attempt to survive, and the quiet getaway that followed. From there, the physical evidence began to close in around her. McNutt had left behind a bloody knife and a bracelet near the scene, and when the DNA on that bracelet was tested, it came back matching her. Witnesses had seen Heilig get into her car earlier in the night. The surveillance of the fleeing vehicle tied the timeline together. One piece at a time, investigators assembled a case that pointed steadily at a single person, even though not one of those cameras had actually filmed the killing. What investigators managed to piece together was a night that had begun casually and turned lethal in a matter of minutes. Heilig had been a stranger in town, out among the bars and music of Ybor City, when he crossed paths with McNutt and climbed into her car of his own accord. He had no way of knowing the person behind the wheel meant to rob him. By the time neighbours in Hyde Park were woken by gunfire and looked out to see a wounded man staggering across their lawns, McNutt was already driving away. Detectives did not have the killing itself on camera, but they had his final minutes, the fleeing car, the witnesses who had watched him get in, and now a name attached to a piece of jewellery. The bracelet she left near the scene, small and easy to overlook, became the single thread that unravelled everything. Because the DNA on it belonged to her and no one else. Facing a first-degree murder charge and the possibility of never walking free again, McNutt chose to take a deal rather than gamble on a trial. She pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of second-degree murder, along with a count of robbery with a firearm, in front of a Hillsborough County judge named Michael Williams in the summer of 2022. For taking the life of a stranger who had made the simple mistake of getting into her car, she was sentenced to 30 years in prison, to be followed by 10 years of probation once that term is served. Justin Heilig died among strangers, on a porch that was not his own, in a city he was only visiting. The cruelest detail of all is that his final moments were not private. A camera meant to do nothing more important than watch over a doorstep instead recorded a dying man pleading for help that arrived too late. And that same ordinary recording became the thread that led investigators straight back to the woman who had put him there. He did not get the chance to be saved. He only got the chance to be avenged. The final case brings the camera all the way back to the killer herself. There is no hidden cab this time, no aftermath standing in for the act. This time, the lens caught the woman right there in the middle of the street, standing over a man who was already down, her arm rising and falling, in a killing whose last chapter was still waiting to be written inside a courtroom. Case 10. Shantika Davis. Grainy security footage from a business across a dark stretch of highway is nearly all that remains of that night. But in it, you can make her out. A woman standing over a man who is already down, her arm rising and falling in what the video shows as stabbing motions. The man got back to his feet and walked away, only to collapse a short distance later. And the camera that caught her is the reason a jury had no doubt at all about what her hands had done. Shantika Davis was 45 years old at the time, known around her corner of Norfolk, Virginia as Tika. The man she was convicted of killing was a 57-year-old named Clarence Jefferson, who went by the nickname K.O. Jefferson spent much of his time around a nearby motel and was, by most accounts, a familiar and well-liked figure in that part of the city. He and Davis, though, had a running conflict between them, the kind of simmering neighbourhood feud most people expect to stay small. On the night of January 8th, 2024, it turned deadly instead. It happened close to 11 at night off North Military Highway, across from what used to be the Military Circle Mall. According to the case laid out in court, an unidentified man attacked Jefferson first, and then Davis joined in on the assault. The violence did not last long. Jefferson managed to break away and walk off down the road, bleeding, before he collapsed near a utility box a short distance from where it had started. He was taken to a Norfolk hospital where he died of his injuries. The camera is what transformed a confusing street attack into a murder conviction. Security footage from a nearby business had captured the whole confrontation. On it, the unidentified man can be seen fighting with Jefferson and manhandling him, and then Davis is seen stepping in, shoving him and swinging her hand down over him in what investigators described as apparent stabbing motions. It is important to be precise about this. The grainy video did not clearly show a blade in her hand, frame by frame. What it showed was Davis standing over Jefferson with her arm coming down again and again in the unmistakable motion of someone striking down at him again and again. Combined with everything else, it was enough to remove any serious doubt about her part in his death. And there was a great deal else. Witnesses in the community identified Davis to police. She admitted being involved in the fight, and she even picked herself out in the surveillance footage, though she tried to explain it away. She claimed a man had paid her a small amount of money to jump into the fight, and she insisted she could not have been the one who killed Jefferson because he had gotten up and walked away afterward. The local Commonwealth's attorney summed up why the case ultimately held together. He pointed to solid police work, to the willingness of ordinary people in the neighbourhood to come forward and identify Davis, and to the video surveillance that, as he put it, showed her role beyond any reasonable doubt. Her trial was held at the Norfolk Circuit Court in front of Judge David Linetti. It ran for just 2 days, on the 20th and 21st of May 2026. The jury did not need long to make up its mind, returning after only about an hour. On May 21st, 2026, they found Shantika Davis guilty of second-degree murder. An hour of deliberation for a killing that had happened out on a public road with a camera running tells you how little doubt the jury was left with. The prosecution had built the case on 3 simple pillars: the police work that identified her, the neighbours willing to say what they had seen, and the footage that placed her standing over Jefferson with her arm rising and falling. Set side by side, those pieces left almost nothing to argue about. Davis had put herself in that frame, and the frame did the rest. As this account is being put together, one part of the story remains unfinished. Davis has been convicted, but she has not yet been sentenced. Her sentencing was scheduled for later in the summer of 2026, and under Virginia law, a second-degree murder conviction can carry a term of up to 40 years behind bars. Whatever figure the judge finally settles on, the conviction itself is beyond serious dispute now, and the man who reportedly paid her to join the attack has never been identified and remains free to this day. What is left once the footage stops is Clarence Jefferson, a man in his late 50s, known and liked around his patch of the city, who lost his life over a neighbourhood grudge and a few dollars handed to a stranger for a few seconds of violence. He walked away from that camera on his own 2 feet, believing he had survived the worst of the night. He had not, and because a business across the road happened to have its camera running, the woman who stood over him in the dark will answer for what she did, even as the people who loved him wait to hear exactly how long she will pay for it. 10 women and 10 cameras that refuse to let the truth stay buried in the dark. Some killers are undone by a witness or a confession, but these were undone by the one thing in the room that never blinked. Subscribe so the next investigation finds you, and we will see you on the next case.